An older black woman is serving drinks in a boardroom meeting. Suddenly, she interrupts the CEO and reveals a hidden clause that could destroy the very company he built. Instantly, they accuse her of causing a disturbance. Tension skyrockets, and security is called to throw her out. What no one in that room knows is that this woman is far more than just a server. And next, she's going to make them regret everything. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. Forgive my interruption, director, but what you've just articulated is a linguistic snare. Should they affix their signatures, they will relinquish dominion over everything. The atmosphere in the room chilled. A dozen finely dressed individuals pivoted in unison. Some blinked in disbelief. Others narrowed their gaze, uncertain who had dared to interject while the most influential man in the chamber was speaking. At the far end of the expansive cherrywood conference table sat Director Kareem Al-Hamad. His impeccably tailored charcoal suit subtly reflected the warm glow of the overhead lighting. His pronouncements, uttered moments earlier in a lesser-known dialect of Arabic, still lingered in the air, like an unacknowledged tension, sudden and sharp. The voice had emanated from the side of the room, not from the designated interpreters, nor the legal counsel, nor even the line of administrative assistants, quietly recording minutes. It belonged to a woman, an older black woman holding a polished tray of chilled beverages, standing with her back pressed against the wall, as if trained to fade into the background. Her name tag simply read Esther. Esther Jenkins did not flinch under the collective startled stares. Her hand remained steady. She gently set the tray on a nearby side table, straightened her posture, and met Director Al-Hamad's intense gaze. Her demeanor was not defiant, but composed, focused, and resolute. He scrutinized her. The quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being the sharpest mind in any gathering wavered, if only for a fleeting instant. Only a second. "You comprehend Arabic?" he queried, now shifting to English, his voice keen, yet controlled. Esther replied in Arabic, utilizing the precise dialect he had just employed. "And I discern the distinction between true intent and clever manipulation." "Your Excellency," someone gasped. A white-haired senior partner from Sterling Holdings leaned back in his leather chair, visibly flustered. "Is she even authorized personnel?" "She's on the serving staff," someone murmured. Director Al-Hamad disregarded them. His eyes stayed fixed on Esther. "Your recent phrasing, permitting flexibility for regional adjustments, was presented as benign, yet its wording implies the capacity to retrospectively invalidate any prior agreement. That is not a safety provision. It is an absolute override clause." The interpreter positioned beside Director Al-Hamad looked down at his papers, perspiring noticeably. "Do you possess legal expertise?" the director inquired. "I hold a master's degree in international finance," she responded, still in Arabic. "And I dedicated 7 years to a development board in Dubai before returning to tend to my ailing mother." The director's eyes hardened. "You interrupt my declaration before my counterparts, then accuse me of dishonesty. This shows extreme disrespect." Esther's lips tightened, but she stood firm. "I intended no disrespect, sir. Only clarity. You are not involved in these negotiations. You are a domestic worker," he stated icily. "Security should escort her from the premises." Esther felt a flush creep up her neck. Across the table, someone mumbled, "Allow her to speak." She might be correct. Another voice, Mr. David Chen from Sterling, interjected with careful diplomacy. "Your Excellency, perhaps we should indeed clarify the provision before proceeding for the assurance of all present." The director did not immediately reply. His gaze bored into Esther. Then, with a dismissive wave of his hand, he waived the idea of her removal, but he offered no apology. "You worked in Dubai?" he asked. "Yes, where the Global Investment Fund Internal Compliance Division." The director tilted his head. "You are more than a domestic worker." "No," Esther said quietly, "but that is what sustains me currently." He did not smile, but he nodded once, then turned to his translator. "How long were you aware of her accuracy?" The man froze. I assume depart," Al-Hamad commanded. The translator hurried out his briefcase, flapping. Esther remained motionless, unsure of her next action. She could feel her heart thrumming, the warmth still rising in her neck. Was she about to be commended or dismissed? The director turned to Mr. Chen. "This meeting is adjourned. We shall reconvene once your team possesses an individual capable of comprehending the documentation. But we tomorrow noon." He rose. Esther quietly exited, moving down the long, echoing hallway toward the staff elevator. She passed a few junior analysts, all too stunned to meet her gaze. As the elevator doors sealed behind her, her shoulders finally slumped. She did not know what the morrow would bring. But for the first time in years, she had not allowed herself to vanish, and someone of consequence had listened. Esther stepped into the service corridor of the Magnolia Grand Hotel, the heavy door closing behind her with a thud that resonated like a final decree. She walked swiftly, not pausing until she reached the staff elevator. As the floor indicators illuminated sequentially descending from the uppermost level, her hands quivered. She balled them into fists and compelled herself to inhale deeply. One breath in, one breath out. She had just confronted one of the world's wealthiest individuals in the presence of a dozen influential executives, and now she stood beside a mop bucket. The elevator doors parted. Inside stood Clara, one of the housekeepers. Her eyes widened when she saw Esther. "Girl, what did you do upstairs? Half the kitchen is buzzing." Esther offered a tight smile. "I might have articulated a little too much." Clara tilted her head. "Too much, or just enough, I do not know yet." Esther replied as the elevator continued its descent. "Perhaps both." They rode in silence for a moment. Then Clara gently touched her arm. "You did what was necessary. You looked out for them even if they were oblivious to their need." Esther nodded. She desired to believe that, but reality was far more complex. When she returned to the employee locker room, her supervisor, Mr. Patterson, was awaiting her. He appeared as though he'd been under intense stress for a significant period. "You are on thin ice," he stated without even a greeting. "I have already received 4 calls from senior management." "I was not attempting to cause disturbance," Esther said. "I overheard something perilous. I spoke up. You spoke out of turn. That was a multi-billion-dollar consultation," he paced. "You embarrassed them. You embarrassed this establishment." "No." Esther responded, her voice calm. "I shielded them from signing away their entitlements." He paused. "Be that as it may, Esther, you cannot simply—" A new voice interrupted. "She remains." Both of them turned. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Vance, the hotel's general manager. Tall, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and an imposing presence, she was rarely seen outside her corner office. Now she entered the room like a magistrate presiding over a court. Miss Jenkins demonstrated more discernment in 5 minutes than some legal professionals do in 5 months. Eleanor continued, "She will not be penalized for that." Mr. Patterson sputtered, but offered no counter-argument. Eleanor looked at Esther. "You are relieved of floor duties for the remainder of the day. Present yourself at my office at 3. Esther nodded slowly, astonished. Eleanor departed without another utterance. At 2:55, Esther stood outside the office on the 28th floor, her palms slick with perspiration. She smoothed down her uniform, suddenly aware of the worn stitching on the collar. When Eleanor opened the door, Esther entered cautiously. The space was minimalist, yet elegant, with panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline. Framed commendations adorned the wall. A single photograph on the desk depicted Eleanor shaking hands with a former senator decades prior. "Sit," she instructed. Esther complied. Eleanor studied her. "You were employed in Dubai?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why did you depart?" "My mother fell ill. I returned to assist." "Then, after her passing?" "Well, the discontinuity on my resume intimidated prospective employers. They ceased to acknowledge my credentials. They only perceived my age, my background." Eleanor nodded. "That is the world. But today you garnered the attention of the right individuals." Esther remained silent. "I researched you," Eleanor stated, tapping her keyboard. "Global Investment Fund 7 years oversaw risk compliance for agreements exceeding $50 million. Yes. You could have simply walked away today. Allowed them to sign. Allowed them to falter." Esther looked down. "I could not. I comprehended the implications of that provision." Eleanor leaned back. "Do you wish to return?" Esther blinked. "Return to the true world, the executive table. You still possess the intellect, the fortitude. What you lack is opportunity. Let us alter that." Esther leaned back stunned. I am uncertain. I have not engaged with a legal instrument in years. That did not impede you from salvaging a significant transaction." Eleanor rose and extended a thick binder to her. "This is the preliminary draft they were reviewing. Annotated. Show me where the critical issues lie. You have 24 hours. Esther clutched the binder as if it were a lifeline. "Thank you." As she prepared to leave, Eleanor added, "And Esther, what you accomplished required immense bravery. That caliber of courage does not go unacknowledged." Back in the staff lounge, Clara gazed at the binder in Esther's hands as though it were fashioned from pure gold. "Girl, is that what I imagine it to be? I believe I am being assessed." "No, sweetie," Clara said with a proud smile. "You are finally being seen." Esther remained awake late into that night. She brewed a pot of herbal tea, sat at the small kitchen table in her one-bedroom apartment, and spread out the binder with adhesive notes, highlighters, and a pen that had belonged to her mother. Her living room light occasionally flickered, and the old radiator clanged like an elder's cough in the corner. But Esther paid no mind. Clause by clause, she meticulously examined the document. The same patterns emerged: deliberate ambiguity, retrospective phrasing, ownership displacement, camouflaged as collaboration. Her back ached, and her eyes blurred. At midnight, she poured herself another cup of tea and gazed out the window. The city shimmered beneath a sky smeared with an orange haze. Somewhere out there, the world was undergoing a transformation, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was transforming along with it. The following morning, Esther once again stood outside Eleanor Vance's office. She had managed no more than 3 hours of sleep, but adrenaline propelled her up the elevator past the polished brass nameplates and marble columns. And now, to this pivotal moment, she clutched the annotated binder to her chest as if it contained her entire future, because it just might. Eleanor looked up as she entered. "You are early," she observed, glancing at the clock. "I completed it," Esther stated, placing the binder on the desk. "I have marked 12 sections with potential manipulation, 6 with cultural misinterpretations, and 4 with legal overreach that could instigate international litigation." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You labored throughout the night." Esther did not reply directly. "It is clearer now, but had they endorsed it yesterday, it would have been catastrophic." Eleanor opened the binder and flipped through the pages. Her expression remained inscrutable, but Esther observed the occasional pause at a marginal note referencing Article 21 of the Global Investment Charter. Another note beside a clause marked "Undefined Authority Transfer." "You still possess it," Eleanor finally declared, gently closing the binder. Esther exhaled slowly, her hands clasped in her lap. "You evoke memories of someone," Eleanor continued. "Your father, Reverend James Jenkins." Esther's heart skipped a beat. "You knew my father." "I did. He was the one who drafted the emergency social equity proposals in the 70s. A quiet man, brilliant mind, never sought recognition. He used to say justice was a prolonged journey, but someone had to commence the walk." A lump formed in Esther's throat. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It appears you inherited more than his eyes." There was a soft knock at the door. An assistant peered in. "Ma'am, Director Al Hamad's representative is here. They have specifically requested Miss Jenkins' presence at the noon renegotiation." Esther's eyes widened. What Eleanor rose. "It seems your voice resonates further than you had anticipated." Esther entered the conference room at 12:01 p.m., this time not as a server, but as a consultant. Her uniform had been replaced with a conservative navy dress, a leather portfolio in hand. She walked past the same men who had seemingly overlooked her the previous day. Now their gazes followed her, uncertain, some skeptical, others respectful. Director Al Hamad sat at the head of the table. This time there was no translator beside him. He acknowledged her with a nod. "Miss Jenkins." Esther replied in Arabic, "Your Excellency." A faint flicker of a smile appeared. He motioned for her to take a seat near him. Mr. David Chen, appearing more disheveled than usual, shifted in his chair. "We have reviewed the agreement and acknowledge that certain provisions require clarification. With Miss Jenkins' input, we hope to achieve mutual understanding." The negotiation commenced. Esther spoke sparingly only when prompted, but each time she did, the tension in the room subtly shifted. Her tone was professional, yet direct, identifying points of contention and offering culturally sensitive revisions. She bridged the gap between legal intent and diplomatic nuance, re-establishing equilibrium in a room that had nearly fractured under misunderstanding. 2 hours in the meeting paused for refreshments. Esther stepped into the hallway, needing fresh air. As she leaned against the cool stone wall, a voice behind her stated, "You do not belong here." She turned. A tall man in a dark suit, Michael Grant, a junior partner at Sterling, stood with arms crossed. "Excuse me," Esther replied. "You are not a party to this transaction. You lack appropriate clearance, and you certainly do not have a seat at this table merely because you rectified a single sentence." Esther did not respond immediately. She simply regarded him, calm, composed. My clearance, she said softly, is inscribed in the footnotes you disregarded. Before he could respond, Eleanor appeared beside them. Mr. Grant, if you harbor concerns regarding personnel assignments, you may address them with me. Grant mumbled something and walked away. Eleanor turned to Esther. Are you all right? Esther nodded. He is simply resistant to change. Good, Eleanor affirmed, because change is occurring and it is looking directly at you. Back in the room, the atmosphere had shifted. Director Al-Hamad leaned forward as Esther elucidated how to rephrase the compliance provision. She employed a metaphor from ancient texts about cultivating desert roses in unfamiliar soil, but tending to them with diligent care. He listened, then nodded. You speak with more than mere words, he observed. You speak with profound insight. By the conclusion of the meeting, both parties had concurred to redraft the agreement. No one articulated it explicitly, but the room understood Esther had brokered the resolution. As the executives filed out, Director Al-Hamad remained seated. Esther, he stated, you spoke truth to authority yesterday. That is a perilous and infrequent act. She bowed her head. I did not intend to speak. I simply could not remain silent. He reached into his pocket and produced a coin. In our culture, when an individual preserves a negotiation, we present them with a token, not as remuneration, but as a memento. He placed the coin in her palm. It was ancient, inscribed with intricate Arabic script and worn at the edges. Thank you, she said quietly. Later that night, upon returning home, Esther placed the coin beside her father's photograph on the bookshelf. The lamplight caught the metal, perfectly casting a long shadow behind it. For the first time in a considerable while, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, and more profoundly, she felt remembered. 3 days after the renegotiation, Esther Jenkins found herself entering a room she never imagined accessing. It was not the grand conference hall, nor Eleanor's private office, nor even the opulent suite of the director. It was the legal department on the 32nd floor. Behind a biometric secured door she had once merely passed while carrying a tray of bottled water. Now she was stepping in with a clearance badge and a fresh identification clipped to her blazer. Inside the room hummed with controlled pandemonium legal analysts, murmuring over contract printouts, assistants typing notes, a large whiteboard filled with flowcharts and deadlines. As Esther entered, half a dozen heads turned. Some eyes narrowed with skepticism, others simply blinked surprised. At the far end of the room stood a familiar figure, Eleanor Vance, flanked by Harold Croft, the firm's senior legal counsel. Esther Eleanor stated, her voice crisp. Pleased you are here. We are examining preliminary drafts for the next 2 joint ventures with Director Al-Hamad's firm. Harold looked at Esther with raised eyebrows. You are not a licensed attorney. I am a licensed analyst with expertise in international finance and risk compliance, Esther replied calmly. I do not need to dispute the law. I merely need to identify the pitfalls. He gave a non-committal grunt and returned to his documents. As Esther settled into a desk beside the legal team, her fingers brushed the polished mahogany surface. She recalled wiping down tables such as this just a few weeks prior. Now she was scrutinizing documents that could impact millions. But the transition was not without friction. Hours into her audit, a junior analyst named Bethany leaned over. Just out of curiosity, she said in a low voice, how does one transition from hospitality to high-level strategy? Is this some sort of diversity initiative? Esther kept her eyes on the page. I suppose when you understand what a trap clause appears like in Arabic, opportunities tend to materialize. Bethany chuckled bitterly and turned away. Esther took a breath. She was not there to validate herself. She was there because they had failed to perceive what truly mattered, and she had not. By late afternoon, Esther had flagged 3 significant inconsistencies. One clause shifted liability in the event of market volatility, potentially exposing the hotel to foreign litigation. Another subtly restructured control rights under the guise of flexibility. And the third, buried deep within the intellectual property, licensing, implied a perpetual surrender of brand usage rights. She emailed her observations to Eleanor, then descended to the lobby cafe for a moment of tranquility. As she stirred her tea, a man approached. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and carried a leather briefcase embossed with gilded initials. Esther recognized him, Mr. Silas Thorne, external counsel and long-standing advisor to Sterling Holdings. You made quite an impression, he remarked as he sat across from her without invitation. I am simply performing my duties. Silas leaned in. I have read your annotations. They are incisive. Some might even label them as assertive. Esther gave him a level look. Some might deem them effective. He smiled faintly. You are treading on very established ground, Miss Jenkins. Just exercise caution where you place your feet. Esther set her teacup down. I do not aim to impose upon anyone, but I will not circumvent dangers to protect fragile egos. Silas nodded slowly. Fair enough, but in this metropolis, truth possesses sharp edges, and it frequently cuts those who wield it. With that, he rose and departed. That evening, Esther received a message from Eleanor private meeting. 7:00 p.m. top floor. She arrived at the penthouse suite uncertain of what to anticipate. When the doors opened, she was greeted by candlelight mellow jazz and the director himself seated near the balcony. He rose. Esther, please sit. She hesitated. I was unaware this would be a private discussion. Yes, it had to be. Too many ears downstairs. She sat across from him. I wish to express my gratitude, he stated. We finalized the amended agreements today. Because of your insight, we averted a future conflict. Esther inclined her head. I simply acted as anyone with a conscience would. No, he said softly. Most would remain silent. You challenged me publicly, and you were correct. A prolonged silence settled between them. Then he added, I have had many advisors. Few I trust, fewer still I remember. Esther smiled politely. I am not seeking to be remembered merely to be helpful. He chuckled. Then allow me to offer something of utility in return. He presented her with a small envelope. Inside was a contract for consulting work with his firm's American division, a generous retainer, remote flexibility, full access to global teams. I cannot. Esther began. You already have, he interjected. This merely formalizes what you have demonstrated. She held the contract with careful hands. It was more than employment. It was recognition vindication. Later, as she stood beneath the night sky, the breeze caressing her cheeks, Esther looked up at the illuminated windows above the city. Just weeks ago, she was meticulously cleaning glass in those very offices. Now, she was reshaping the operations within them. The struggle was far from concluded, but for the first time she possessed a place at the table, and she was not relinquishing it. 3 days into her new consulting engagement, Esther Jenkins arrived early at the downtown office of Al-Hamad Capital's American branch. The building, with its sleek dark glass exterior and polished marble lobby, hummed with quiet precision. Esther wore a charcoal blazer and comfortable leather flats. Practical, confident, she carried a tablet laden with reports and a mind honed by years of silent observation and vigilance. But she was no longer merely seen. She was being watched. It began subtly. Files she requested would disappear for hours before reappearing incomplete. Her badge access would sporadically malfunction at certain entrances, compelling her to wait until a receptionist rectified the issue. Comments were exchanged in hushed tones as she walked by. Not all of it was overtly hostile, but it was evident someone disapproved of her presence. Still, Esther pressed onward. That morning, she sat across from Rashid Al-Farsi, a risk analyst from Dubai, who had flown in to facilitate Esther's onboarding. Rashid was taciturn yet efficient, with a gracious demeanor and a sharp intellect. As they meticulously examined a logistics memorandum, Rashid glanced up. You know they anticipated you would accept the remuneration and recede. Esther looked up. Who are they, the board? Half of your floor. Rashid smiled softly. Instead, you arrived and requested the original documentation. I do not endorse merely symbolic appointments. Clearly, they resumed their work, but the air between them shifted charged with mutual respect. Later that afternoon, Esther stepped into the copy room for a swift printing task. As the machine hummed, she overheard 2 voices outside the door. I am telling you, she is delving too deeply. She was expected to comply politely, not question the Geneva transfer. She flagged it to Eleanor. If it proceeds to compliance, the voices faded as the speakers moved away. Esther froze. Geneva transfer. She had not reviewed any documents mentioning Geneva. She returned to her desk, pulse quickening. That night, in her modest apartment, she opened her laptop and delved into archived documents. The system still permitted her access. Using a search filter, she typed Geneva. One result materialized buried in the footnotes of a miscellaneous assets file linked to a Shell subsidiary. The sum was staggering $15 million designated as community infrastructure reallocation. But there was no project attached, no timeline, no authentic signatures, just a reference code and a transaction path that looped through 3 distinct nations. Esther leaned back in her chair. This was not an error. It was a concealment. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should she flag it or investigate further? Her phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor. Private meeting. 7:00 a.m. my office. Alone. Esther barely slept. At dawn, she dressed in dark slacks, a simple navy blouse, and pulled her hair back into a neat bun. She entered the building through the side security entrance and rode the elevator alone. Eleanor's office was bathed in the early morning sun. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her coffee untouched on the table behind her. "You discovered it," she stated without turning. "I have not vocalized anything," Esther replied. "You do not have to. The system logs your searches. I received the alert." Esther stepped closer. "What is it? A payment disguised?" It was pushed through just before the director's initial U.S. visit. Some members of the board desired to sweeten the deal in advance. "I only became aware 2 weeks ago, and I have been quietly amassing what I can, but I required someone they would not suspect, someone they presumed was too new, too insignificant." Esther's breath hitched. "You utilized me." Eleanor turned. "I trusted you. That is not the same." "No," Eleanor said quietly, "it is not. But Esther, you comprehend how many individuals in this building would rather allow this to disappear than risk a scandal. It is not merely embezzlement. It is a betrayal to the director, to our partners, and to the people who place their faith in this company." Esther looked down at her hands. "What transpires now? I need you to complete what you began. Uncover the full trajectory of that money. The board convenes in 10 days. If we can prove who authorized it, we can eradicate the corruption. And if we cannot, then you revert to cleaning windows, and I am replaced by someone who will pretend they observed nothing." Esther departed the office in a whirlwind of thoughts. Her head buzzed, but her heart remained steady. This was not the position she had applied for, but it was the underlying reason she had been summoned. That night in her apartment, Esther meticulously examined encrypted files connecting transaction identifiers, tracing wire transfers through Cyprus, Singapore, and ultimately Geneva. The deeper she delved, the more unsettling it became. Names began to surface. One in particular caused her to pause: Mr. Silas Thorne, the very man who had cautioned her about truth's sharp edges. She captured a photograph of the file with her secure phone, encrypted the image, and transmitted it to Eleanor. 1 minute later, her screen went black. A shutdown. System override. She stared at the dark monitor. In the hallway outside her apartment, footsteps echoed. Someone new. Esther did not move. The screen had gone black, but the faint hum of her computer tower persisted, a ghostly resonance in the quiet of her apartment. She sat, frozen eyes fixed on the blank monitor, her breathing shallow. Then she heard it again, the slow, deliberate sound of someone outside her door. One step, then another. The old floorboards of the hallway creaked under pressure too heavy for a neighbor heading to the elevator. This was different. She rose slowly, her mind racing. Her phone was still in her pocket. No service, no Wi-Fi. Someone had severed her connection. Another creak. She reached for the small desk drawer, pulling it open soundlessly. Inside, nestled beneath old receipts, was her late father's heavy brass paperweight. She gripped it tightly, not for defense, but for its reassuring weight. Then came the knock, a single heavy knock that did not request permission. It demanded it. Esther moved to the door and pressed her eye against the peephole. A man in a dark jacket stood there. No delivery, no badge, no expression. His face was devoid of emotion, his posture calm, but his eyes surveyed the hallway like a predator. He knocked again. She did not answer. After a minute, he turned and walked away, but not before pausing to look directly into the peephole, as if he knew she was watching. Esther waited until she was certain he was gone, then exhaled slowly. Her fingers trembled as she powered down the machine and extracted the hard drive from its casing. She placed it into a sealed bag and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard in her closet. She did not sleep that night. By morning, she was at a cafe 2 blocks away, utilizing a prepaid phone and connecting through a public Wi-Fi network. She dispatched an encrypted message to Eleanor. "I was compromised. Suspect physical tail. Must convene off-site." 10 minutes later, the reply arrived. "Understood. Riverside Library basement conference room. Noon. Destroy this number." At 11:45 a.m., Esther entered the library. Her heart pounded with every step. This place, once a childhood sanctuary of storybooks and silence, now felt like the precipice of a battleground. Eleanor sat alone at the far end of the basement conference room. No files, no laptop, just a pen and paper. "You are not paranoid," she stated as Esther entered. I received a security alert. Someone attempted to access my drive remotely at 3:00 a.m. That is not a coincidence. I traced the Geneva path, Esther said. The final signature is from Silas Thorne. He is the key, but someone already knows we have identified him. Eleanor leaned forward. Then we act now. Discreetly. Do you have the backup? It is concealed. I will retrieve it tonight. Good, because tomorrow I am presenting this directly to the director himself. Esther's eyes widened. You are not proceeding through compliance. Not with the board compromised. He deserves to know who is betraying him. Esther nodded. Then I will acquire what you require. That night, Esther returned home through the back stairwell, her eyes scanning the shadows. Her apartment was quiet, no signs of forced entry. She moved swiftly, pulling up the floorboard and retrieving the drive. But when she turned, she was not alone. Silas Thorne stood in her living room. Well done, he said, his voice smooth. I informed you that truth cuts both ways. Esther did not flinch. You are not here for pleasantries. No, he admitted. I am here to propose a settlement. She raised an eyebrow. You forcibly enter my residence to negotiate. I prefer the term intervene. Intervene in what? In your crusade. Esther, listen. This struggle, it is not about right or wrong. It is about who endures the repercussions. And I am offering you a means of escape. 6 figures, a new identity, a fresh beginning. She stared at him. So I vanish, and you continue to launder funds through cultural programs and shell corporations. He shrugged, something to that effect. His face hardened. Then comprehend this, the moment Eleanor steps into that meeting, she is finished. They will entangle her in bureaucracy. And you will transition from consultant to a cautionary tale. Esther's voice dropped. You threatened me the day we met. Now you are merely confirming your true nature. Silas stepped closer. You have no comprehension of the world you inhabit. Perhaps Esther conceded, but I am learning rapidly. She reached into her pocket and activated a small device, an old recording dongle clipped to her coat. It had been recording since she walked in. Silas looked down. That will not be admissible in court. It does not have to be, she said. It merely has to reach the director. He stared at her for a prolonged second, then turned and walked out. The next morning, Eleanor received a USB drive in an envelope delivered by courier. No sender, no return address. Inside, a note in Esther's handwriting. The rest is up to you. Eleanor inserted the USB into her tablet and pressed play. The director listened silently as Silas's voice echoed through the speakers, arrogant and assured. When it concluded, there was a long pause. He looked up, his eyes resolute. We terminate this. For the first time in decades, Esther Jenkins had ignited a spark in the murky corridors of corporate secrecy. And now a conflagration was imminent. The morning sun permeated the glass facade of Al Hamad Capital's American headquarters, but the energy in the boardroom felt colder than a New York winter. Esther Jenkins slid into the chair beside Eleanor Vance, the two women poised against anticipation. Today's agenda, new venture proposals, and most critically addressing the clandestine payment orchestrated by Silas Thorne. Director Kareem Al-Hamad entered first, his presence commanding. He moved directly to the head of the table without exchanging pleasantries. His eyes, dark and discerning, swept over each board member before settling on Esther. Miss Jenkins, he stated in English, his voice soft but firm. Your evidence was compelling. Esther inclined her head. Thank you, Your Excellency. Eleanor adjusted her notepad and clicked her pen. We have reviewed the USB and corroborated it with internal audit trails. She turned to the director. Mr. Thorne authorized the transfer without full board approval. He even manipulated compliance controls to obscure the trail. She keyed a slide onto the display behind her showing wire routes through Cyprus, Singapore, then Geneva. There was a collective murmur. Esther noticed half the room stiffened, particularly Silas's legal counterpart, who appeared pale. A board partner spoke up, his voice measured. If this occurred before my tenure, why did it not surface earlier? Eleanor responded without hesitation. Because Mr. Thorne removed those transactions from standard reporting. Internal audit flagged minor inconsistencies, but Thorne denied access. She turned back to Esther. That is when Miss Jenkins commenced tracing it through encrypted logs. The room collectively swallowed. Director Al-Hamad closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. I entrusted my American operations to seasoned professionals. I did not anticipate deception from within. Silence pervaded the space. I desire an independent inquiry. And until that concludes, Mr. Thorne must relinquish his compliance duties. Even from where she sat, Esther could feel tension crackling. Silas Thorne sat slack-shouldered but unbowed. Eleanor clicked again. Additionally, Miss Jenkins' workflow revealed equity provisions in upcoming venture contracts that mirrored yesterday's trap clause vague language that could grant override authority retroactively. She paused. There are 2 new proposals awaiting your signature, Director. May we have your permission to send them to Esther for review before final signing? Director Al-Hamad's gaze sharpened. He turned to Esther. Are you comfortable with that? She swallowed. This was more than what she had envisioned. Yes, Your Excellency. I would be honored to assist. A board partner nodded slowly. Then it is settled. A murmur of approval rose from the Western board members. Mr. David Chen cleared his throat. Esther's participation here. It signifies a new echelon of transparency. I endorse it. The director inclined his head. Very well. Let it be known no document reaches my desk without her review. As the meeting transitioned to new venture discussions, Esther felt both exhilarated and somber. She introduced herself to Dr. Rashid Al-Farsi, who had flown in again. They exchanged a silent understanding. Strength in partnership was growing. By midday, Esther was escorted to a small meeting room overlooking the river. Spread before her were digital drafts of 2 agreements, one for a renewable energy joint venture, the other for a global supply chain partnership with a Southeast Asian firm. Esther clicked open the first. The preamble appeared conventional enough, but she quickly discerned a familiar phrase, contingent override, based on regulatory recalibration. She tapped the tracker and typed a note. Requires precise definition of recalibration. Suggest amendment to specify jurisdiction and time limitation. In the second draft, her eyes caught a section on intellectual property licensing. Licensor grants exclusive rights in perpetuity, as long as operational sustainability criteria are met. Operational sustainability. Who defined it? What metrics perpetuity granted excessive power to one party? She flagged defined sustainability metrics, limit term to 5 years, require annual joint review. Her fingers hovered over the send button. She paused, then pressed it. In that moment, she reminded herself this was more than merely editing legal text. It was safeguarding fairness. At 3:00 p.m., Eleanor walked in, coffee in hand. Some board members questioned your suggestions, Silas especially. He labeled them unnecessary red tape. Esther pressed her pen against her notepad. I am not here to impede progress, merely to ensure clarity. Eleanor smiled. That is all that truly matters. He termed ittered tape, a firm voice stated from beside her. Angelina Park, a senior compliance officer, stepped in. Someone needs to inquire why these clauses persistently appear in new dealings. Esther nodded at Angelina. That is precisely why I highlighted them. Angelina glanced at the screen, then at Esther. Excellent work. The afternoon proceeded with Esther's comments circulating back to legal counsel. She was invited to elaborate. She explained cultural disparities from Middle Eastern legal traditions, where vague phrasing sometimes veiled discretionary powers. She emphasized that in a Western corporate environment, transparency necessitated specificity. Each phrase she offered was met with nods from Gulf advisors and cautious curiosity from American counsel. At 5:30, the meeting concluded. Eleanor and Esther departed together. Outside, Eleanor slipped an arm through Esther's. You constructed a bridge today, but the foundation remains precarious. Esther exhaled. I observed the identical issue in the initial agreement. I just did not anticipate it to be systematic. Eleanor shook her head. This runs deeper, but we will patch each vulnerability one clause at a time. At her apartment that evening, Esther prepared dinner, a bowl of lentil soup, crusty bread, herbal tea. She turned on soft NPR background noise. The news reported low market volatility, yet her own world was volatile enough. Esther poured soup into 2 bowls, then hesitated, then ate half of each. She sipped tea and watched the city lights flicker. She thought of her father's worn Bible, the one she kept tucked under her bed, how he once said, "A bridge does not shield you from the storm. It allows you to traverse it." Tomorrow, there would be more directives, more provisions. But tonight, she advanced another mile of the journey, because a bridge once built must endure. By the 3rd week of Esther Jenkins' consulting tenure, something profound shifted, not solely within the confines of Al-Hamad Capital, but within Esther herself. She no longer navigated the building unnoticed. Security personnel greeted her with measured nods. Junior analysts whispered her name with equal parts curiosity and circumspection. Executives once dismissive now regarded her as an indispensable component of a complex challenge. But with respect came pressure. Early Tuesday, Esther arrived at her temporary office to find a thick manila envelope awaiting her on her desk. No name, no stamp, just the words, "For your eyes only, Heritage Holdings." She closed the door, drew the blinds, and opened the envelope. Inside were scanned copies of transaction ledgers from a subsidiary she did not recognize, Heritage Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, but rerouted through Cayman Islands accounts. There were repeated payments labeled Project Facilitation, totaling over $30 million in the last fiscal year. Each line item was imprecise. Some referenced offshore vendors, others were marked Asset Relocation, Confidential, but one note buried at the bottom of the second page stood out: Q4 2023, Community Uplift Initiative, diverted. The word resonated. She dug deeper, pulling up internal memos stored in archived email chains. Esther discovered that the Community Uplift Initiative had been part of a public partnership approved for supporting educational infrastructure and vocational training in underserved urban communities across the South. Yet the funds had never arrived. Instead, the diversion flowed to a private equity firm with ties to Silas Thorne's former law partner. Her chest tightened. This was not merely corporate misconduct. It was moral larceny, money pilfered from communities struggling with outdated schools and lacking essential resources. She needed verification. Esther emailed Angelina Park and Rashid Al-Farsi for a discreet meeting in the back cafe of the building. That afternoon, the three women sat in a booth tucked behind a potted fern wall. Esther slid the pages across. This arrived anonymously. Heritage Holdings, involved in rerouting $30 million. It should have funded vital community programs. Rashid scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing. That firm. I have seen it mentioned in our London files. Angelina leaned forward. You said diverted to where a shell firm in Nevada owned by Crestline Equity. Guess who sits on their advisory board, Thorne? They both answered in unison. Rashid whispered, he is more deeply entrenched than we had realized. Angelina bit her lip. We need this officially documented. We approached the director again. Esther shook her head. Not yet. If we proceed now, Thorne will obscure it before we complete linking the trail. We require irrefutable concrete evidence, not just indicators. Rashid tapped his pen. There is a retired financial controller, Brother Samuel Green. He used to manage internal audits before he was forced out during a restructuring. He might possess original records. Esther nodded slowly. Can you contact him? Angelina offered. I will try. He trusted me once. 3 days later, Esther, Rashid, and Angelina sat in Brother Samuel Green's modest townhouse in Queens. He was in his 70s, weathered, with a neatly trimmed white beard, and wore a thick, cable-knit sweater. His home smelled of lemon polish and aged paper. I knew this day would arrive, Samuel said, pouring tea. They believed I was too elderly, too slow. The truth is, I retained copies, not for retribution, but for righteousness. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a dusty lockbox. Inside were ledgers, emails, and internal memos dating back 8 years, all connected to Heritage Holdings and the Community Uplift funding. This is your undeniable proof, he stated, but be cautious. Silas Thorne is not operating alone. Esther opened one ledger and felt a chill. Among the names was someone unexpected: Harold Croft, the firm's legal counsel, and a personal friend of Director Al Hamad's. Her heart pounded. If we implicate him, it will destabilize everything. Samuel looked her directly in the eye. Then destabilize it, or this cycle will repeat itself. That night, Esther reviewed every document. She connected timelines, flagged key transfers, and mapped the connections between Heritage Holdings, Crestline Equity, and compromised accounts. She constructed a master file, encrypted it, and backed it up on 3 separate drives. In her notes, she labeled the final folder The Unseen Accounts. At dawn, Esther sent one copy to Eleanor, another to Rashid and Angelina, and one to a secure external legal advisor whom Samuel had recommended, a former federal prosecutor turned corporate ethics consultant. Then she waited. By 10:00 a.m., she received a reply from Eleanor. This will ignite a firestorm. Are you prepared? Esther typed back. The house was already ablaze. We are simply sounding the alarm. She understood what was to come next. At the subsequent board meeting, Eleanor and Esther would present their comprehensive findings. There would be no denials. This time, they possessed signatures, timestamps, email chains, and Samuel's sworn affidavit. But more importantly, they possessed truth. Not merely corporate truth, moral truth. the kind that illuminates concealed corners people hoped would remain in darkness. As Esther sat at her desk, sipping bitter black coffee, she gazed out at the skyline. The wind swept through the city, brushing against glass towers and forgotten alleys. Somewhere below, a child attended a school with crumbling infrastructure, a school that might still be underserved, but perhaps not for long because someone had finally deciphered the accounts. The boardroom was colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. Silence hummed more loudly than speech, and the long mahogany table stretched between the accused and the accusers like a chasm. Esther Jenkins sat with her back straight, her laptop open, her fingers resting calmly on the keyboard. Eleanor Vance was beside her, exuding quiet indignation, a folder of paper documents fanned in front of her like a deck of irrefutable facts. Across the table, Silas Thorne sat tight-lipped, a muscle twitching beneath his jaw. Harold Croft, the firm's legal counsel, and until now untouchable, glanced between them with a forced smile, the kind worn by men who perceive their impending downfall, but still desperately cling to a lifeline. Director Al-Hamad arrived last, flanked by two Gulf partners and his translator. He gave a brief nod, then took his seat at the head. "Proceed," he stated, his voice low. Eleanor began. "Your Excellency, what we are about to present is not simply a financial anomaly. It is systemic, it is deliberate, and it represents a profound betrayal of everything your foundation was intended to embody." She gestured toward Esther. Esther clicked a button. The monitor illuminated behind her with a flowchart of transactions starting with Heritage Holdings, branching into Crestline Equity, then dispersing like spores into offshore accounts, all linked back to projects originally designated for humanitarian and educational aid. For 7 years, Esther began her voice steady. These funds were diverted. Projects approved in good faith, including the Community Uplift Initiative, were stripped of their allocated finances. Over $30 million vanished through layers of shell corporations. We traced the IP signatures. We matched login credentials, and we obtained sworn testimony from brother Samuel Green, a former controller forced into premature retirement after questioning these transactions. Eleanor handed a printed affidavit down the table. A few board members leaned in, their brows furrowing. Esther continued. The misdirection was intentional. Mr. Thorne approved payments marked as project facilitation, often weeks before public votes. The oversight was not a clerical error. It was orchestrated. Silas opened his mouth, but Eleanor raised a hand. "You will have your opportunity." Director Al-Hamad coughed. "Allow her to conclude." Esther clicked again. Another slide appeared, this one displaying email correspondences. Furthermore, she stated, "We found communications between Mr. Thorne and Harold Croft discussing contingency protections should this come to light." Language included phrases like mitigate public outcry, utilize procedural delays, and, in one instance, neutralize potential whistleblowers. Harold's smile fractured. "This is taken out of context." Director Al-Hamad turned to him. "Is it your voice in these emails?" Harold shifted. "I cannot confirm without viewing the full threads." Eleanor handed him a printout. "You authored them the 15th of May. 2nd of July, 18th of August, Esther interjected. The date of the diversion aligns with the board's final endorsement of the Community Uplift Initiative. You exploited trust for personal gain." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the director leaned forward. "Mr. Thorne, Mr. Croft, do you deny these findings?" Silas stared at the screen, defiance flickering in his eyes. "We acted in the firm's best interest, diversifying assets, optimizing capital flow. By stealing humanitarian funds, one Gulf partner hissed. Harold attempted a different tactic. The legal structure permits flexible allocations within subsidiaries. Do not insult me." The director snapped, his composure shattered. "We finance these initiatives to restore what others have damaged, to empower what has been disregarded, not to enrich charlatans in suits." He stood. "In accordance with Clause 7.4 of the Board Governance Charter, I'm enacting emergency oversight and immediate suspension of both Mr. Thorne and Mr. Croft. Their access to internal systems is revoked pending formal investigation." A flurry of activity ensued. IT personnel entered the room. Silas's laptop was confiscated. Harold's phone was seized. Esther watched them both diminish. Not physically, but spiritually. The curtain had fallen. The performance was over. Eleanor whispered to Esther, "We succeeded." But Esther was not yet celebrating. Her eyes swept the room. She understood enough to recognize that predators do not always reveal themselves openly. Some remain quiet and observe. After the meeting, the director requested a private word with Esther. Inside his personal office, a sun-drenched suite adorned with books and Middle Eastern tapestries, he poured her tea himself. "You have served this firm with greater integrity in weeks than some have in years," he stated. "Why did you contend so vigorously?" Esther hesitated. "Because I have resided in places where justice was an afterthought, and I will not permit it to remain that way if I can prevent it." The director nodded slowly. "There is strength in that resolve. I perceive it." He handed her a small envelope. "My team will extend a permanent advisory position to you. Full clearance, equal voice." Esther opened the envelope but did not look inside. "Thank you, but I require time to contemplate." "I respect that." That night, Esther sat on her fire escape, the city glowing beneath her. The air was cool. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed. She looked at the envelope again, then set it aside. Her father's old compass sat beside her, the same one he carried through civil rights demonstrations. This triumph was not solely hers. It belonged to every voice that had been silenced, every child lacking educational opportunities, every worker whose ethics had been submerged by profit. And as she gazed into the night, Esther knew this was merely the genesis. The reckoning had arrived, and the accounts were no longer unseen. The following morning, the hallways of Al-Hamad capital buzzed with an energy that was neither relief nor jubilation. It was uncertainty. Silas Thorne and Harold Croft were gone, suspended indefinitely. Their names no longer appeared in the system directory. Their offices were locked down and sealed for audit. Yet power, Esther knew, never simply dissipates. It shifts. It waits. It seeks out vulnerabilities. Esther walked into the 24th-floor conference room for an unscheduled internal compliance meeting. At the head of the table sat Dr. Rashid Al-Farsi, who had assumed interim oversight of internal risk management. Next to her were Eleanor Angelina and two newly introduced partners, one from Dubai, the other from Houston. Rashid commenced the session with clarity. "We have removed two of the firm's most senior figures in less than 2 weeks. That creates a void, and voids attract opportunists." Esther nodded. "We cannot allow the structural weaknesses they exploited to persist. If we only remove individuals but retain the systems that shielded them, we have accomplished nothing." Eleanor added, "We need to reconstruct with transparency from the inside out. That entails redefining oversight processes, true compliance, not merely superficial performance." The Dubai partner, a lean man in a tailored navy suit, leaned forward. "And it necessitates some uncomfortable dialogues." There are still stakeholders who supported Thorne and Croft. The Houston partner, older and more pragmatic, spoke softly. "People do not betray institutions accidentally. They do so because they believe no one is observing." Esther tapped her notebook. "Then let us make observing a foundational policy, not a reactive measure." By noon, the team had drafted the first iteration of a new compliance framework, mandatory quarterly audits, with independent third-party oversight, anonymous whistleblower channels with guaranteed legal protection, and a rotating ethics committee with cross-departmental representation. It was audacious, and it was indispensable. Later that afternoon, Esther met privately with Eleanor in her office. Eleanor closed the door and offered her a seat. "You have altered the very rhythm of this place, Esther. People converse differently now. They listen. I did not accomplish it alone." "No," Eleanor admitted. "But you were the catalyst, and now you must decide what kind of transformation you wish to initiate next." Esther exhaled. "The director offered me a permanent role, strategic ethics advisor." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And I have not decided because remaining signifies committing to a system I have only just begun to trust. And departing means abandoning the work that truly matters." Eleanor leaned back. "You know what I believe. I believe the system is only as principled as the individuals willing to remain and rectify it. And you are principled." That evening, Esther took the subway to Brooklyn, to a community center where she used to volunteer. She had not returned in years. The center looked largely the same: peeling paint, boisterous children, metal chairs in the foyer. But the energy was familiar. She found Mr. Davies, the retired teacher who once managed after-school programs there. "Esther," he inquired, adjusting his glasses. "Hello, Mr. Davies." "It has been a while. You appear as though you have been contending with formidable adversaries. Perhaps just their accountants," she replied. He laughed, a deep, crackling sound. "Still sharp. Come in." They sat in his small office where walls were lined with old photographs of students and volunteers. Esther explained what had transpired, the whistleblowing the contracts, the stolen funds intended for urban communities. When she finished, Davies was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You remind me of your father. You know that he never raised his voice unless it was on behalf of someone else." Esther looked down. "I merely wish he could witness it." "Oh, I believe he does." As she departed the center, Esther paused by the wall near the exit. There was an old photo from 25 years ago, a group of volunteers with fists raised in front of a mural. There on the far right was a teenage Esther beside her father, both grinning widely. She smiled. Some legacies required no grand monuments. Back at her apartment that night, Esther finally opened the envelope the director had given her. The offer was generous, far more than she had ever envisioned earning. But it was not the monetary aspect that resonated with her. It was the letter inside handwritten, "Miss Jenkins, in the tales my grandfather recounted, justice was always deliberate but inevitable. He stated the ones who illuminate candles in darkened chambers are the ones we remember. You illuminated a candle here. Remain. Assist us in keeping it burning. Karim Al-Hamad." The next morning, Esther walked into the director's office before the board convened. He looked up from his desk, surprised but calm. "I accept," she stated. His eyes twinkled. "Then let us commence." At the meeting that followed, Esther was introduced not merely as an advisor, but as a permanent voice on the Strategic Ethics panel, a role created specifically for her. Applause followed, not thunderous, but sincere. Even some who had once doubted her nodded with respect, and when the meeting concluded and everyone filtered out into the hallways of marble and glass, Esther lingered. She gazed at the empty boardroom, the place where falsehoods had once resided, cloaked in expensive suits and silk, and smiled. There was still so much work to be done, but for once, authority aligned with rectitude. Esther Jenkins stepped back into the grand lobby of the Magnolia Grand Hotel with a sense of quiet determination. Gone was the staff lanyard that once defined her, now replaced by a badge identifying her as Strategic Ethics Advisor for Al-Hamad Capital's American Operations. She paused beneath the crystal chandelier, inhaling the mingled scent of fresh magnolias and polished marble. Every detail of this place bore witness to her transformation from carrying trays to shaping policy, and she carried the weight of that journey with profound gratitude. "Miss Jenkins," a familiar voice called. It was Clara, the housekeeper, who had supported Esther from the very first day. She stood near the concierge desk holding a small wrapped gift. When their eyes met, Clara's broad grin illuminated her warm face. "You achieved it," Clara said simply, handing over the package. It was a delicate wooden jewelry box, faintly scented of cedarwood. "Clara, open it," she urged. "You have earned it." Esther lifted the lid. Inside lay a brass token etched with the words "Voice of Integrity," encircled by elegant Arabic calligraphy. Caught between surprise and emotion, Esther held it close. Clara reached out and squeezed her hand. "This belongs to you," Clara stated, "from everyone upstairs who says thank you." Esther swallowed. She had never imagined she would be honored for stepping forward, but here she was in a place that had initially overlooked her, now revering her courage. That afternoon, she sat in the concierge lounge with Eleanor Vance. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the steam rising from their tea. "They are planning a commemorative plaque," Eleanor whispered in the lobby. "A plaque," Esther blinked. Eleanor nodded. "Beneath your brass token. They desire the inscription to read, preserved by a voice that refused to remain silent. It will be visible to every guest who enters." Esther felt a warmth deep in her chest. She envisioned travelers, executives, visitors pausing, reading those words, perhaps remembering that it is never too late to speak up. That evening, the construction crew arrived discreetly. They affixed a small brass plaque at the base of the concierge desk. Evening light caught its gleam as Esther brushed past on her way out. Her phone buzzed. A message from Rashid community leaders in Atlanta and Chicago have been informed. They are mobilizing long-term monitoring teams. You initiated something far grander than us. Esther closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. This was not merely corporate adjustment, it was real-world justice reaching distant communities. Educational resources, accountability, broken promises being mended. A week later, Esther attended the public unveiling of the plaque. A small crowd gathered: employees, Gulf partners, journalists, hotel guests. A Gulf board member delivered a brief speech, his voice filled with gratitude. Then Eleanor invited Esther forward. Cameras clicked. Microphones captured her smiling face. She cleared her throat. "I do not know the dimensions of this plaque," Esther began, "but I know the magnitude our voices can achieve. Regardless of our origin, regardless of our occupation, a domestic worker can convey a message. A domestic worker can pose a critical inquiry. And that is where courage originates." She looked out at the faces, some curious, some emotional. "This plaque is not exclusively mine. It belongs to every individual here who selects clarity over convenience, justice over silence, truth over comfort. Let it serve as a reminder when you speak someone hears." Polite applause transformed into a genuine ovation. Cameras flashed. The lights reflected off the plaque, casting warm tones across hopeful faces. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Clara hugged Esther tightly. "You did it," she whispered again. Esther nodded. "We did it." That night, she sat on her rooftop in Queens, the city's lights sprawling like stars at her feet. She held the brass token and scrolled through text messages of support from colleagues, community elders, former classmates, even her mother's old friend calling to congratulate her. Somewhere in the city, educational programs were being audited. Somewhere, someone was finally heard. Esther smiled and tucked the token into her pocket beside her father's compass. She looked up at the moon, clear and steadfast. Her journey had not concluded. It was merely commencing. The plaque and the accolades were testament that integrity possessed a place in towers of glass and steel. But true power resided in quiet persistence, difficult choices, and the courage to speak when silence seemed easier. The wind stirred and Esther closed her eyes. This city would perpetually hum with ambition, cacophony, compromise, but one voice, hers, had risen above it, and in that reverberation, others discovered their own strength. Spring sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Al Hamad Capital's executive lounge, catching motes of dust that drifted over the polished mahogany table. Esther Jenkins sat between Director Kareem Al Hamad and Eleanor Vance, the newly formed Ethics Council gathered around them. Today's agenda formalizing the new Integrity Charter and adapting it to projects beyond the United States. Esther's heart pounded as she reviewed her notes, a testament to how far she had come, from cleaning lobbies to shaping corporate philosophy. Director Al Hamad cleared his throat. "We have observed how one voice altered our trajectory. Now we must ensure that voice becomes a unified chorus." He glanced at Esther. "The Integrity Charter, will you present its framework?" Esther rose, feeling the council's attention lock onto her. She clicked a remote, and the screen displayed the charter's key pillars: transparency, accountability, inclusivity, cultural sensitivity, and community partnership. She pointed to each icon. Transparency necessitates open reporting of redirected funds and accessible audit trails. Accountability means no one, regardless of rank, is beyond our ethical purview. Inclusivity ensures teams reflect diverse perspectives. Cultural sensitivity mandates review from local stakeholders before agreements are finalized. And community partnership commits a percentage of profits to the original project communities. Eleanor added, "This charter also encompasses mandatory training for all levels and an anonymous reporting hotline monitored by the Ethics Council." Director Al Hamad nodded thoughtfully. "A bold charter. What do you anticipate will be its greatest challenge?" Esther paused. "Resistance from those accustomed to obscurity. Some board members perceive this as bureaucracy. Some regional teams may view transparency as vulnerability. We must demonstrate its inherent strength." An American partner spoke up. "How do we apply this globally, say in East Asia or Africa, without imposing American values?" Esther answered carefully. "We adapt the principles, not the intent. Cultural sensitivity means local councils review agreements before regional projects launch. Our objective is not to enforce compliance. We enforce respect." A partner from Dubai raised a point. "And whistleblower protections, will they include visas and relocation support?" Esther had anticipated this. "Yes. Any reporter of misconduct will receive legal and financial support to relocate if necessary. No fear of retaliation, no visa jeopardy." There was a moment of tense silence. Then Director Al Hamad stated, "This is more than policy. It is legacy. And if you believe in this, you will lead its oversight. Esther, will you serve as chair?" Esther paused. The weight of the role pressed on her chest. She thought of her father's words, "Justice often begins with one mind willing to act." She looked at Eleanor's supportive nod. "I accept," she said softly. A murmured round of respect passed through the council. Eleanor reached out and squeezed her hand. As the council disbanded, Esther was met by Rashid and Angelina in the hallway. Rashid's eyes glowed. "You did it." Angelina raised her phone. "Board minutes state you are now Chair of Ethics Global Oversight." Esther exhaled. "That signifies responsibility beyond these walls." "Yes," Rashid said, "but it also means we alter more than just one transaction." That evening, Esther returned to her Brooklyn apartment. She carried an envelope with official council stationery. Inside her appointment letter and the printed final integrity charter. She placed it on the bookshelf beside her father's compass and the brass token. A moment of quiet pride settled over her. Then the phone rang. "Eleanor, are you free tomorrow morning?" Her voice crackled over the line. "For breakfast?" "Yes. We will meet the leaders of the Southern Community Coalition. They wish to define local oversight metrics for educational outreach projects." Esther smiled. "I would be honored." The next morning, Esther stood before a small circle of community leaders, school principals, vocational trainers, local educators, members of community councils in a modest building in Atlanta. They were there because projects tied to Al-Hamad required transparent metrics, and Esther's council aimed to deliver that. She spoke plainly. "We seek your input. How do we know funds reach the students? How do we measure long-term sustainability? How should the board be accountable?" An elder named Sister Mary responded, speaking through a local organizer. "We measure attendance, job placement rates, literacy levels, access to digital resources. That is true impact." Esther scribbled diligently. Other leaders inquired about financial reporting, quarterly town halls, oversight committees. A community teacher suggested youth apprenticeships tied to project maintenance. Each idea felt like constructing a bridge between boardrooms and living rooms. Back in the evening, Esther reviewed her notes, feeling a deeper sense of connection. The council's charter had taken root in policy, but here it began to blossom in real lives. At midnight, Esther stepped onto her rooftop again. The city lights glimmered. She held the integrity charter in her hands. Letters white and bold, "We commit to justice through action." She closed her eyes and listened. The city's hum, a distant siren, wind on brick. A part of her wondered, could this ripple out beyond projects, beyond corporations? Could this serve as a model for systems everywhere? A distant church bell struck midnight, echoing back more than 12 hours. Esther whispered into the night, "We shall see." The next morning would arrive as it always did, and with it more agreements, more communities, more tests of the charter's strength. But for the first time, she knew the threshold had been crossed. Integrity, once elective, was now foundational, and this time everyone could perceive it. The boardroom on the 37th floor was filled with city light, though today that brightness only emphasized the gravity in the air. Esther sat at the center of the Ethics Council panel, the Integrity Charter gleaming in front of her. Around the table, Gulf Partners regional managers and corporate attorneys waited. This was the first quarterly review since the charter's implementation, and expectations were high. Esther opened the meeting with a nod. "Thank you all for attending. Today we will hear reports not only on financial compliance, but also on impact, how our projects affect communities, stakeholders, and partners." Brother Marcus, a regional director from West Africa, dressed in a crisp suit and patterned tie, was the first speaker. "Our vocational training initiative in Ghana exceeded expectations. Thanks to your transparent bidding, local contractors were engaged. We funded junior instructors, and local schools now have operational training workshops under student stewardship." Nods and murmurs of approval followed. The man smiled. "We are cultivating accountability and opportunity." Esther spoke up. "Thank you. Can you share the measurable metrics you utilize to demonstrate project success to stakeholders?" He activated a slide. Percent program completion, hours of training provided reports of student job placements, educational outcome improvements compared to projected targets. Esther glanced at Dr. Nia Campbell, an NGO monitor present via video link from Nairobi. Nia nodded. "Their data model aligns with our oversight metrics. This is promising." Next, a representative from Texas spoke about community resource centers for an underserved urban neighborhood. "We tracked community engagement monthly, surveyed participant satisfaction, and asked locals to submit quarterly reports. We published results on a public portal." A Gulf partner leaned in. "Publish publicly, that is quite daring." The Texas manager replied, "Transparency fosters trust, and trust builds sustainability." Esther acknowledged this. "Now, let us address compliance issues observed this quarter." A compliance auditor stood. We flagged 5 agreements containing ambiguous clauses resembling override language. 4 have been resolved via clarification. 1 remains pending review with regional counsel. Esther traced her pen sharply. Which agreement? A Southeast Asian logistics deal, he said. It still contains a clause allowing retroactive adjustment based on operational exigencies. Heads turned. Esther's heart thudded. This was the moment they had been warned about the charter under pressure, where obscurity re-emerged. "May I?" she stated and walked to the screen. Pulling the draft up, she read aloud. "Should operational exigencies arise, the provider will evaluate and adjust the agreement unilaterally." She stopped. That is override by another name. A Gulf counsel interjected quietly, but operational exigencies do exist. Yes, Esther agreed, but not without mutual review. We require a revision, specify triggers, define mutual deliberation, set sunset clauses. A debate followed. Attorneys worried about legal complexity. Regional teams cited local regulations. Esther listened, then addressed them all. "We drafted this charter to uphold integrity. Without clarity, regulations become loopholes." Silence. Then the Gulf partner spoke. "I propose a pilot amendment adjust this clause to include explicit approval from both regional oversight and local community council. Let us monitor its effect." Esther nodded. "Agreed, and we will review the results next quarter." The meeting concluded with votes taken, smiles exchanged, and a sense of cautious accomplishment. That evening, Esther returned to Brooklyn for a community fundraiser for a new educational study in Atlanta. Eleanor was there, greeting attendees. Esther spotted a community elder she had met in Atlanta. It was their 3rd initiative together. They embraced. The elder whispered, "The school is thriving now. Children are learning." They laughed softly. Esther's eyes welled. "That is your work. We accomplished it together," the elder replied. Esther looked around the hall. Volunteers, fiscal analysts, smiling families. Integrity was not just on paper. It was reverberating across towns, schools, nations. Back home, Esther prepared for a late-night call. It was Brother Samuel Green, whose retired life had resumed, but whose influence was far from diminished. "They are utilizing your model in 2 African outreach bids," he said proudly. "Transparency measures baked into contracts. It is spreading Esther." She paused. "We have crossed a line where trust became transactional." He chuckled. "You transformed your echo into a wave." Esther smiled. Her father's compass and her brass token sat together on her desk, symbols of direction and integrity. She looked out at the city where lights shimmered like promises. This was not merely a campaign. It was a movement. A movement that had commenced when a domestic worker spoke up and now traversed oceans. A low spring rain drizzled over Manhattan as Esther Jenkins stepped off the elevator and entered the sleek, high-ceilinged boardroom. Today's meeting agenda was unexpectedly brief. She had called it herself. The board's newest directive hung in the air, piloting an integrity council model for other firms and nonprofits. Esther's heart pounded knowing this marked a new phase. Eleanor arrived moments later and gave Esther a reassuring nod. The room filled quickly with partners, compliance officers, and 2 external consultants from major foundations. Esther opened with a calm breath. "Thank you all for joining on short notice. We stand at a juncture not just of ethics within our organization, but at a point to demonstrate leadership across our entire industry." She clicked to the first slide, Phase 1 confidential rollout within sister firms. The slide displayed a simple plan of pilot councils embedded in Al Hamad's regional offices across Asia and Africa. Below bullet points read, "Shared reporting platform community engagement metrics and annual transparency awards." Eleanor followed. "We have already seeded the pilot in Nairobi and Singapore. Initial results show a 40% decrease in contract disputes and increased local hiring." Murmurs rose around the table. Esther clicked again. Phase 2 external partnerships. "We will invite 2 major foundations to adopt our model in their grant partner agreements. We have drafted letters to the Gates Foundation and Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors." One Gulf partner raised a hand. "Our board must see financial projections for this expansion. What is the return on investment, or do we categorize it as an expense?" Esther responded, "The return is not immediate revenue. It is reputational capital, mitigated risk, and long-term partnership leverage. We estimate a 15% increase in investor confidence calculated through reduced due diligence costs and enhanced credit ratings." A senior financial officer leaned forward. "That is compelling, but how do we quantify it?" Esther smiled. We track discount spreads on social impact bonds, investor survey scores, and secondary market performance for projects under the Integrity Council versus controls. The finance executive nodded thoughtfully. Phase 3, Esther explained, involved publicly publishing a yearly integrity impact report benchmarked across projects, a move both bold and transparent. Another consultant inquired, what if this reveals failures or non-compliance? Eleanor answered firmly, because it will, and that is the objective. Esther added, we will highlight successes, but also areas for improvement. Openness cultivates trust beyond mere perfection. There was a pause as the room absorbed the implications. Operating on this scale meant vulnerability, but an executive from Dubai spoke next. I support this. If we truly champion integrity, we embrace both our triumphs and our shortcomings. Heads nodded. The board accepted the pilot unanimously. After the meeting, supporters clustered around Esther and Eleanor, offering congratulations and handshakes, but the shift felt more significant than applause. It was purposeful. Later that evening, Esther attended a private reception at the Metropolitan Museum's Modern Wing, where Al Hamad was unveiling a new art sponsorship. Among the guests were NGO leaders, Gulf dignitaries, and foundation representatives. Esther spotted the Gates Foundation lead Dr. Elena Vargas conversing near a sculpture on ethics. Taking a breath, Esther approached. Dr. Vargas, thank you for attending. Her voice softened under the subdued gallery lighting. Dr. Vargas turned. Miss Jenkins, I have heard remarkable accounts. Esther smiled. I wish to invite you to review our Integrity Council model. Your insights would be invaluable. The foundation director nodded. Send me the proposal. I believe there is genuine potential here. Esther exhaled quietly. This moment symbolized tangible growth beyond her organization, a bridge into broader impact. That night, Esther and Eleanor met quietly on the rooftop of the hotel sponsoring the gala. Rain had ceased. City lights danced across wet streets. You did it, Eleanor said, handing Esther a warm drink. We did, Esther corrected. She gestured to the skyline. Observe how far this can extend. Eleanor sipped slowly. I would like to see this model go global with you leading. Esther paused, then nodded. Let us construct that roadmap. As midnight approached, Esther reflected on how this pivotal moment echoed her initial act interrupting a meeting with a bold truth. That act alerted a world receptive to integrity. She thought of her father's compass and Samuel's ledgers of children receiving better education and communities empowered, and she understood. If speaking up initiated it, this pivotal shift transformed it into a legacy. Her phone buzzed. A message from Rashid Integrity Council invitation dispatched internationally. Responses already incoming. Esther closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Rain had brought a calm to the city, but tomorrow that calm carried an undercurrent of change. A pivotal shift that started here could now recalibrate systems. Tonight, Esther Jenkins stood at another threshold, not merely within a corporation, but at the turning point of what integrity could genuinely signify. And this time, she was not just the voice. She was the architect. Esther arrived at the director's suite at precisely 9:00 a.m. The early light glinted off the polished marble floors of Al Hamad Capital's top floor, marking this day as distinct, more consequential, more conclusive. She carried a slim tablet loaded with the complete dossier, Heritage Holdings ledgers diverted, community uplift funds, shell company links, transcripts of incriminating emails, and Brother Samuel Green's sworn affidavit. Today, she would guide the director through the complete truth. As she entered, Director Al Hamad looked up from his desk. He nodded once, a gesture of both greeting and solemnity. He had arranged this to be private, no witnesses. No fanfare, just truth spoken plainly as a test of their resolve. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. Esther set the tablet on the desk and tapped the screen. Yesterday, we presented the public summary. Now the full disclosure. She began with the transaction chains line by line, date by date, explaining payments routed through Delaware, Singapore, Cayman, Nevada, always diverted from approved community projects. The director traced his fingertip over a digital flowchart, his expression unreadable. She spoke with care, clarity, and compassion, aware this moment would define more than a contract. It would define trust. Moving on to email evidence, Esther narrated each exchange in calm English, pausing when the director looked away, allowing the weight of betrayal to settle. She emphasized the roles of Silas Thorne, Harold Croft, and other unnamed complicit executives. These memos are not allegations, they are confessions. The director leaned back, absorbing. His gaze went distant, perhaps lost in memory of the communities betrayed. When she reached Samuel's affidavit, she tapped the quote, "I kept copies because the work mattered more than the firm." The director closed his eyes as though absorbing the moral weight. Esther paused. His silence was sufficient. Finally, she offered the tablet. "I invite your questions. Our next step is yours." He looked up. His face was inscrutable. "You have restored my vision," he said softly. "I was blind, trusted structure more than people." He closed the tablet gently. "Your disclosure is comprehensive, and your courage is evident." Esther watched his eyes. "What happens now?" He rose and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Rain clouds gathered. He folded his hands behind his back. "We rectify. We provide restitution. We restructure. We rebuild trust, not only here, but in every place we impact." He turned. "I desire you to lead oversight with full authority and final say on project disbursements." He extended his hand. "Will you undertake that?" Esther paused. Thoughts spiraled, community voices, boardroom battles, late nights, tracing funds her father's compass. She took his hand. "Yes." He nodded firmly. "Then together we will make this company something worthy of the name it bears." Back in her Brooklyn apartment that night, Esther held the tablet close. The path ahead would test her defining new standards, ensuring restitution, confronting resistance. But tonight she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her father's compass and brass token by her side, symbols of direction and integrity. She thought of Samuel Green's quiet bravery, of community elders who trusted her, of Eleanor, who believed of every child, whose education might now be secure of justice, embodied, not merely articulated. She realized the disclosure did not conclude the journey. It commenced a deeper one. The city lights shimmered through her window. Somewhere beyond skyscrapers and streets, systems that had been built on convenience and compromise would now feel tremors of change. Esther closed her eyes, remembering her father's words. "Justice does not slumber. It awakens us." She whispered into the still night. "Then let it be awake, and tomorrow it would begin again." Sunlight filtered through the frosted glass door of Esther's new office, labeled in brass letters, "Esther Jenkins, Global Ethics Advisor." It was a quiet, dignified space overlooking the East River, lined with shelves holding binders, artifacts from community engagements, and atop her desk the brass token and her father's compass. That nameplate did not just mark her office, it marked progress. She stepped in on her first official day, greeted by Rashid and Angelina, who had arrived early. "Looking excellent," Angelina said with a half smile. Rashid handed her a large manila envelope, the deployment schedule for the Integrity Council pilots across 3 continents, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. "It is happening," Rashid said softly. They sat at the round table. Eleanor, already there, had coffee ready. "Congratulations," she said. "So where do we begin?" Esther took a breath. "We follow the roadmap from our pilot. We refine it for global complexity. We will conduct ethics workshops in Mexico City next week, then gap assessments in Romania, and community roundtables in Bangkok." Eleanor nodded. "Board requires your full report in 60 days. Esther turned to Rashid. "We also need local auditors and cultural consultants in each region." Rashid agreed. "We have identified partners." He gestured to Angelina. "Angelina is compiling baseline data now." Esther pressed send on the email. "Today we begin building a global legacy, not just for me, but for every community we serve." That afternoon, Esther visited the hotel lobby plaque. A quiet moment of reflection. She ran her fingertips gently over the engraved words. Staff passed her offering polite nods. In one glance, she felt the full weight of what she had earned and the responsibilities that lay ahead. 2 days later, Esther presented to a board call with international partners watching via video link. She wore a sleek navy suit, professional yet approachable. The digital slides displayed new progress draft charters, recruitment of advisors, and a pilot summary from Latin America. A Sao Paulo representative smiled through the screen. "Our regional advisory board is ready to review. We have added indigenous leaders and local NGOs." A Romanian consultant echoed, "Our compliance review commenced today. Training materials appear robust." In Bangkok, a young woman spoke about community participation in project oversight. "Communities feel acknowledged," she stated. Esther nodded, feeling emboldened. This signifies progress, but we need to share insights among regions, replicate best practices without imposing learning from one another. Questions arose on currency fluctuations, data privacy, legal jurisdictions. Esther and her team answered with clarity, and each response strengthened the network's confidence. After the call concluded, Eleanor squeezed Esther's shoulder. "You commanded the room." Esther's heart fluttered. "We built the room." That evening, Esther returned to her apartment to find a package from brother Samuel Green. Inside were old photographs, Samuel in the firm's office 30 years ago, a younger Eleanor, even Esther's father during early philanthropic visits. A note, "Keep memories close. They remind us why." Esther placed them beside her compass. Tears pricked her eyes. In each photograph she perceived a lineage, integrity passed down, commitment carried forward. A week later, Esther attended a quiet ceremony at the Magnolia Grand Hotel's lobby. A second plaque had been placed, this one recognizing the initiative Integrity Council global launch with Esther's name beneath. Eleanor stood with her, and they watched guests pause, read, and comment. A businessman inquired who Esther was. A young intern snapped a photo for Instagram. Esther smiled, knowing her nameplate was not just brass. It was emblematic of what accountability truly resembled. That night, Esther walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. The city lights stretched into the horizon. She touched the pocket that held her compass and token and thought of tomorrow, meetings in Rome, virtual sessions with Sao Paulo, video calls with Bangkok, a global network of ethics advisors, local monitors, community partners. She whispered into the night wind, "This is merely the beginning." Through the misty glow, the bridge stood strong, and so too did the movement she had helped forge. Esther Jenkins landed in Mexico City at dawn, the sprawling capital awakening beneath a rose-tinted sky. She stepped off the plane, suitcase in hand, and was greeted by Carlos Mendoza, a local consultant and longtime supporter of transparency movements in Latin America. They shared a brief embrace, both acutely aware that what they were doing here was larger than any single contract or firm. This was an experiment and a promise carried across hemispheres. Their first stop was a modest government office in a historic district, its walls lined with framed watercolor murals and rows of small wooden desks. Carlos introduced Esther to regional stakeholders, community organizers, environmental engineers, municipal auditors, members of indigenous councils, and legal advocates. They greeted her with respect, not default deference, but expectation. They had been preparing for this moment. Esther cleared her throat. "Thank you for being here. We are here to listen and learn to build an ethics council that belongs to this city, not to us." She tapped her binder, local language charters, bilingual training materials, baseline data from initial audits. A council member named Sophia, representing a neighborhood affected by industrial runoff, spoke first. "Our community has been promised remediation before. Money arrived, but canals remain polluted." She leveled her eyes at Esther. "So how do we ensure that does not recur this time?" Esther nodded. "By making funding and oversight visible, by ensuring community monitors nominated by your neighborhood possess direct reporting authority, and by structuring disbursements so money is released in phases tied to milestones verified on site." Another attendee, a municipal auditor, raised the issue of mistrust between government and the private sector. "We have witnessed half-completed projects because political priorities shift." "How do you protect against that?" Rashid, sitting with Esther, responded. "The council includes provisions for binding community agreements. These are registered in municipal charters, and audits are public. Changing administrations will not erase them." A tribal elder spoke through Carlos's translation. "In our culture, a promise is a pact. We understand legal terms, but we also require the spirit." He placed a hand on Esther's arm. This feels like a pact." Later that afternoon, they toured a canal near the city's outskirts where funds had earlier been designated for water treatment. Esther walked with Sophia and municipal engineers inspecting pipes, gauges, and water test results. They stopped at a vandalized sign that read Proyecto Comunidad, a remnant of a failed public project. Esther knelt and placed a small token from her pocket, the brass Voice of Integrity emblem, beside the broken post. It was not a fix, but it was a promise. Back in the evening, Carlos and Esther met at a local cafe. Over coffee and churros, they reviewed the day's notes pilot charters refined with local input training modules adapted for Spanish-speakers council members nominated from affected neighborhoods. They sketched a plan for presenting the model to local media next week, ensuring transparency from day one. Before sleeping, Esther sent a brief encrypted update to Director Al-Hamad. Mexico City pilot launched. Local council formed. First milestone scheduled. The reply came quickly. Your work illuminates the path. Continue. 2 days later, Esther participated in a live televised forum hosted by a respected local journalist. She stood on a small stage with Sophia and other council founders. The headline questions, will this pilot succeed? Is it merely greenwashing? Can foreign firms be trusted? Esther spoke clearly. This is not public relations. It is structural. We built safeguards before contracts were awarded. We opened funding timelines publicly. We elected monitors who report to their communities and to independent auditors. She looked into the camera. If we fail, we will acknowledge it openly and learn openly. That is how trust deepens, not in secrecy, but in shared accountability. When the show concluded, the audience applauded. Backstage, Sophia hugged her. They believe it, she whispered. Esther left, feeling both exhilarated and solemn. This model was no longer confined. It was moving outward, and every step carried risks. If Mexico succeeded, others would follow. If it faltered, critics would seize upon it. The next day, Esther flew to Bucharest, where Eastern European NGOs awaited her. The pilot workshop began nearly identical, yet uniquely adapted. Questions here centered on digital data security, community integration, institutional corruption, but the framework she had shaped fit like pieces of a bridge molded to different foundations. By the week's end, pilot councils would be established in 5 cities. The ripple had commenced with integrity as its current. On the flight back to New York, Esther looked down at her reflection in the window, tired, hopeful, determined. She touched the brass token in her pocket. The skyline below reminded her how one voice could echo until it became a movement. She thought of her father's compass pointing true north. Today, it guided not just her, but thousands following in her footsteps. Integrity was not static. It was alive, spreading, anchoring itself in new soil. And this ripple, it was unstoppable. The morning sun streamed through the lobby's grand entrance, glinting off the brass plaque Esther had installed nearly 6 months ago, preserved by a voice that refused to remain silent. Guests and employees paused to read it, igniting brief sparks of conversation. The lobby was alive, pulsing with an energy that transcended polished marble. Esther stepped through the lobby with purpose, her ID badge glinting against her blazer, Global Ethics Advisor, Al-Hamad Capital. Clara observed her from behind the concierge desk, their eyes meeting in a moment of mutual recognition and pride. Later, Esther joined Eleanor in the conference room overlooking the Hudson. Several journalists, NGO leaders, and board members were gathered. Today was not just a routine meeting. It was the official launch of the Integrity Council's Compendium, a guide of best practices, case studies, and standardized metrics to direct ethics work globally. Eleanor opened the session. Today we publish the first edition of our Integrity Compendium, a tool for transparency, but more importantly, for accountability. A Latin American ambassador spoke next. This is a blueprint we can adapt to our national infrastructure projects. A Nigerian NGO representative added, this demonstrates how business and community can jointly create accountability. Esther, invited to speak, looked at the assembled crowd. She began, this compendium is not an instruction manual. It is a testament. It is the lived experiences of communities, council members, and professionals who chose clarity over convenience, justice over ease. Within these pages, you will find case studies from Mexico, Romania, Thailand, Atlanta, of monitoring schools, editing contracts, rebuilding trust. Each chapter shows how voices once unseen can reshape systems. She allowed the pause to linger, permitting that truth to settle. Then she continued at the Magnolia Grand beneath this very lobby. A domestic worker spoke truth. That moment reverberated across boardrooms, across continents. Now that echo becomes guidance. If you carry this compendium into your communities, you carry not just policy, but a legacy. Applause followed not for Esther alone, but for what she and hundreds of others had made possible. Cameras flashed. Eleanor placed a signed first copy in Esther's hands, a gesture of ceremony, friendship, solidarity. After the event, Esther returned to the lobby and stood before the plaque again. Clara approached. Esther, she said softly, look around. Around them, employees smiled as visitors read the words aloud. A family paused. A child inquired about the phrase, refused to remain silent. Clara teased Esther gently. Your story is now intertwined with theirs. Esther exhaled. It is theirs. That afternoon, she received a message from the Director Integrity Compendium Live. My respect and gratitude. Beneath the message lay a small graphic, a compass overlaid with a globe, and the words, True North. She showed it to Eleanor. Looks like more than a compass now. Eleanor smiled. Its legacy. Evening found Esther on her Brooklyn rooftop, city lights blazing like constellations. She traced her fingers over the brass token and her father's compass. She reflected on each chapter from the first word spoken in a boardroom to the ripple across continents. It all began with courage and would transform systems. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Brother Samuel Green. Well done. Your echo will carry farther than any of us can walk. Esther closed her eyes, breathing deeply. In the lobby below, her story resided in brass. In boardrooms and communities around the world, her work lived in real lives. Integrity was not static. It had become architecture, infrastructure, ethos. She thought of those who came before her father, marching Clara, cheering Eleanor, believing Samuel, preserving, and those who would follow, community leaders, interns, young professionals. Each would build upon this foundation. Esther whispered into the night air, let us keep walking. And as the city whispered back a mosaic of distant hums, laughter car horns, she understood the echo would never cease. It would carry until silence was only a memory. And truth became the sound that shaped the world. The story of Esther Jenkins reminds us that even the quietest voices can carry the power to transform entire systems. Her journey from the edges of the room to the very heart of global decision-making teaches us that integrity begins with a single choice to speak when it would be easier to stay silent. Perhaps you've had moments like Esther's, times when you saw something unjust but wondered if your voice mattered, times when the weight of doing what's right felt too heavy to carry alone. If this story touched something within you, if it made you think of your own courage or someone else's quiet strength, leave a comment below. Tell us about a moment when integrity guided your path or when someone's quiet bravery inspired you. And if you believe the world needs more stories like Esther's stories that celebrate truth, kindness, and resilience, consider subscribing to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that doing the right thing still matters. Thank you for being here and for listening with your heart.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.